Jack had always been a man of principle, or at least that's what he told himself every time he got into trouble. And boy, did trouble follow him like a lost puppy. But this time, it wasn't just trouble. It was the HOA. Yes, that HOA, the dreaded Homeowners Association, an organization so universally loathed that it might as well be the villain in every suburban horror story ever told. Jack didn't know it yet, but he was about to embark on a journey filled with bureaucratic absurdity, petty revenge, and enough legal jargon to make a law student cry. It all started with a dream. Jack had spent years stuck in the corporate grind, staring at spreadsheets and pretending to care about quarterly earnings reports. One day, while sipping lukewarm coffee in his gray cubicle, he had an epiphany. Life was too short to live under fluorescent lights. So he quit his job, sold his condo, and bought a plot of land in rural Arizona, a place where the only neighbors were cacti and tumbleweeds. He envisioned a life off the grid, free from utility bills and societal expectations. Solar panels? Check. Rainwater collection system? Check. Composting toilet? Double check, because nothing says freedom like turning your own waste into fertilizer. Jack was living the dream, or so he thought. One sunny morning, as he was admiring his solar-powered chicken coop, yes, even the chickens were off the grid, a letter arrived in his mailbox. This was odd because Jack didn't have a mailbox. He had nailed a wooden box to a tree as part of his rustic aesthetic. The letter was from the HOA, a name Jack didn't recognize because he hadn't signed up for any HOA nonsense when he bought the land. The letter began with the usual pleasantries. Dear Mr. Smith, followed by a thinly veiled threat disguised as legalese. Apparently, Jack owed $3,000 in unpaid HOA dues and was in violation of several community guidelines. Guidelines? What guidelines? Jack lived miles away from civilization. The letter accused him of failing to maintain approved landscaping, not connecting to the municipal power grid, and this one really got him, not having an aesthetically pleasing mailbox. Jack stared at his tree-mounted mailbox and muttered under his breath. Aesthetically pleasing? It's artisanal. Jack decided to ignore the letter because, frankly, it sounded ridiculous. But the HOA wasn't done with him. Over the next few weeks, they sent more letters, each one more aggressive than the last. One letter threatened to place a lien on his property if he didn't pay up. Another accused him of disrupting community harmony by refusing to mow his yard. Yard? Jack's yard was desert sand and sagebrush. Was he supposed to vacuum the dirt? Eventually, Jack decided to confront them head-on. He drove into town and found the HOA office tucked between a nail salon and a vape shop, an architectural masterpiece of mediocrity. Inside, he met Karen, the HOA president who looked exactly like someone named Karen should look. Short haircut, clipboard in hand, and an aura of self-importance strong enough to power a small city. Mr. Smith, Karen said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, we've been trying to contact you about your violations. Violations? Jack replied incredulously. I live off the grid. I don't even use your roads or utilities. Karen's smile widened, a predator sensing prey. Well, Mr. Smith, your property is technically within our jurisdiction. Jurisdiction? Jack scoffed. I'm surrounded by cacti. Karen ignored him and launched into a spiel about community standards and bylaws, all of which sounded like they'd been written by someone who hated fun. Jack tried reasoning with her. Look, I'm not bothering anyone. I just want to live my life in peace. Karen's eyes narrowed. Peace is achieved through compliance. Jack left the office fuming but determined not to give in. He wasn't going to let some clipboard-wielding tyrant dictate how he lived his life. Over the next few weeks, things escalated quickly and hilariously. The HOA started sending inspectors to Jack's property to document every possible violation they could find. One inspector complained that Jack's solar panels weren't aligned with community standards, whatever that meant. Another criticized his rainwater collection barrels for being unsightly. Jack responded by painting smiley faces on them. But the piece de resistance came when Karen herself showed up at Jack's homestead with an entourage of HOA board members, all armed with clipboards and judgmental expressions. This is unacceptable, Karen declared as she pointed at Jack's composting toilet setup. It's eco-friendly. Jack shot back. Karen sniffed disdainfully. "It's disgusting." Jack grinned mischievously and replied, "Well then, don't use it." The confrontation reached its peak when Karen tried to take photos of Jack's property as evidence for their upcoming lawsuit against him. Yes, they were suing him now. In response, Jack unleashed his secret weapon, his chickens. You see, Jack had trained his chickens, or at least convinced them, to chase intruders off his land. As soon as Karen stepped onto his property line, dozens of angry chickens came charging toward her like feathered warriors on a mission. Karen screamed and ran back to her car while her clipboard-wielding entourage scattered like bowling pins. Jack stood there laughing so hard he nearly fell over. But despite this small victory, Jack knew he couldn't rely on chickens forever, though they were tempting. The HOA was relentless. They filed their lawsuit and demanded payment for dues plus penalties. That's when Jack decided it was time for revenge. Not petty revenge like painting smiley faces on barrels, but epic revenge worthy of legend. He started researching HOA bylaws and discovered that many of their rules were vague or outright unenforceable under state law. Armed with this knowledge and fueled by righteous indignation, Jack prepared for battle, and thus began one man's war against bureaucracy, a war fought not with guns or swords but with sarcasm and legal loopholes. Jack wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every homeowner who'd ever been harassed by an overzealous HOA president named Karen. And if there was one thing Jack knew for sure, it wasn't over until he said it was over. Jack wasn't the kind of guy who did things halfway. When he decided to live off the grid, he didn't just dabble in solar panels and backyard gardening. No, Jack went full homesteader, rainwater collection systems, composting toilets, and chickens that roamed freely like tiny feathered anarchists. His dream was simple: escape the suffocating rules of modern society and live a life of rugged independence. What he didn't realize was that HOA rules were like glitter, impossible to escape, even in the middle of nowhere. After his initial run-in with Karen and her clipboard brigade, Jack dove headfirst into research. He wanted to understand exactly what kind of Kafkaesque nightmare he had stumbled into. It turned out that HOA rules weren't just arbitrary. They were meticulously designed to suck every ounce of joy out of homeownership. Jack discovered something called the CC and RS covenants, conditions, and restrictions, which sounded less like a set of community guidelines and more like a medieval torture manual. Apparently, these CC and RS governed everything from mailbox design to landscaping choices, and they were legally binding for anyone who owned property within the HOA's jurisdiction. The kicker? Jack had unknowingly agreed to these rules when he bought his land. Who reads the fine print? Jack muttered as he flipped through pages of legalese that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. One section outlined penalties for unsightly landscaping, which explained why Karen had been so offended by his desert aesthetic. Another section detailed fines for failure to maintain property harmony. A phrase so vague it could mean anything from painting your house the wrong shade of beige to owning chickens that clucked too loudly. Jack's favorite discovery was the ARC, the Architectural Review Committee, a group of self-appointed aesthetes who decided whether your property was visually acceptable. The ARC had rules about fence height, exterior paint colors, and even the types of plants you could grow. Jack imagined them sitting around a conference table debating whether succulents were too edgy for their community standards. But Jack wasn't one to back down from a fight. If Karen and her clipboard army wanted war, he'd give them war. His first act of defiance was subtle but satisfying. He installed a mailbox shaped like a chicken. It was both functional and absurd, a perfect middle finger to the HOA's obsession with aesthetics. Karen sent him a letter within days, demanding its removal on grounds that it violated community standards. Jack responded by painting it neon green. The next battle came over landscaping, or rather, Jack's lack thereof. The HOA insisted that every property maintain approved greenery, which apparently didn't include sagebrush or tumbleweeds. Jack argued that his native desert plants were environmentally friendly and required no irrigation, a fact that should have earned him praise in an era of water shortages. Karen wasn't impressed. She sent him another letter threatening fines if he didn't install grass within 30 days. Grass? In Arizona? Jack laughed so hard he nearly fell off his composting toilet. Instead of complying, Jack decided to double down on his desert motif. He built a rock garden featuring sculptures made from discarded solar panel parts and named it the Garden of Spite. Karen showed up with 2 ARC members to inspect it, all 3 wearing matching polo shirts that screamed suburban tyranny. They took photos, scribbled notes, and left without saying a word. The next letter accused Jack of creating an eyesore detrimental to community harmony. Jack framed it and hung it above his chicken-shaped mailbox. But the HOA wasn't done with him yet. They started sending inspectors to his property weekly, each one armed with a checklist longer than a CVS receipt. One inspector complained about his rainwater barrels being unsightly, so Jack painted them with murals depicting Karen as a dragon hoarding gold. Another inspector criticized his composting toilet setup for being non-standard, prompting Jack to install a sign above it that read, Karen's Throne. The real showdown came when Karen herself tried to enforce a rule about noise levels, specifically targeting Jack's chickens, which she claimed were disruptive. This was ironic considering Karen's voice could shatter glass when she yelled at her board members during HOA meetings. Jack decided it was time for revenge. Not petty revenge like neon mailboxes or spiteful rock gardens, but something bigger. He began researching Arizona state laws regarding HOAs and discovered several loopholes in their enforcement practices. For example, HOAs couldn't legally impose fines without proper notice or documentation, a rule Karen had conveniently ignored in her zeal to punish Jack for existing. Armed with this knowledge, Jack filed a formal complaint against the HOA with the State Attorney General's office, citing multiple violations of homeowner rights. He also started attending HOA meetings, not as a participant but as an antagonist. He'd sit in the back row wearing sunglasses and sipping coffee from a mug that said, HOA equals hell on earth. At one particularly heated meeting, Karen tried to justify raising HOA dues by claiming they needed funds for community beautification projects. Jack raised his hand and asked if those funds would cover therapy sessions for residents traumatized by her leadership style. Karen glared at him but said nothing. Jack wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every homeowner who'd ever been harassed by an overzealous HOA president named Karen, or Susan or Bob or whoever else thought their clipboard gave them divine authority over other people's lives. And while the battle was far from over, one thing was certain. Jack wasn't going down without a fight, or without making everyone involved deeply uncomfortable along the way. Because if there was one thing Jack knew how to do better than live off the grid, it was being an absolute menace when provoked. Jack didn't set out to become a folk hero, but by this point, he was well on his way to being the Robin Hood of disgruntled homeowners. Word of his antics had spread like wildfire through the HOA community grapevine. Residents who had spent years silently resenting Karen and her clipboard tyranny began treating Jack like a local celebrity. People he'd never met were stopping by his property to shake his hand, drop off baked goods, or just gawk at the now infamous chicken mailbox. One elderly neighbor even whispered, "You're doing God's work," before scurrying away like she'd just committed a crime. But Jack wasn't in it for the glory or the cookies, though they were a nice bonus. No, this was personal now. The HOA had declared war on him, and Jack wasn't about to back down. He was like a dog with a bone, except the bone was a stack of HOA bylaws, and the dog had a vendetta. The next escalation came in the form of a certified letter from the HOA's legal counsel. A man named Richard, though Jack immediately nicknamed him Dick. The letter accused Jack of willful noncompliance and threatened legal action if he didn't pay his outstanding dues and remove his unauthorized modifications. Read: chicken mailbox, rock garden, and rain barrel murals. Jack read the letter twice, then pinned it to his fridge like it was a kindergarten art project. Willful noncompliance, Jack muttered to himself. That's just fancy lawyer talk for "you hurt Karen's feelings." Jack decided it was time to take things up a notch. He started by filing an official countercomplaint against the HOA with the county zoning board. His complaint alleged that the HOA's rules were overly restrictive and potentially violated state laws protecting homeowners' rights. He also included photographic evidence of Karen parking her car illegally during one of her property inspections. A petty move, sure, but Jack figured if they were going to nitpick his rain barrels, he could nitpick their parking habits. Next, Jack got creative. He began hosting weekly community workshops, on his property under the guise of promoting sustainable living practices. These workshops were open to anyone in the neighborhood and featured topics like solar panel installation, composting basics, and how to legally outsmart your HOA. The workshops quickly became popular, not because everyone wanted to learn about composting, though some did, but because they provided a safe space for residents to vent about Karen and her minions. Karen, naturally, was furious. She showed up uninvited to one of Jack's workshops and tried to shut it down on the grounds that it violated HOA rules about unauthorized gatherings. Jack calmly pointed out that his property wasn't technically part of any common area governed by those rules. Karen turned redder than a sunburned tourist but couldn't come up with a rebuttal. "Feel free to stick around," Jack said cheerfully as Karen stormed off. "We're about to start the session on how to paint your rain barrels without getting fined." But Karen wasn't done yet. A few days later, Jack received another letter. This one informing him that the HOA had officially filed a lawsuit against him for unpaid dues and multiple violations of community standards. The letter included a court date and a list of grievances so long it could have doubled as a CVS receipt. Jack read through the list with equal parts amusement and disbelief. Among the more ridiculous accusations were failure to maintain an approved mailbox, unauthorized landscaping modifications, noise disturbances caused by livestock, his chickens, public displays of antagonistic behavior toward HOA officials. Jack couldn't decide whether to laugh or frame it as modern art. The lawsuit might have intimidated someone else, but not Jack. If anything, it only fueled his determination. He spent hours researching similar cases online and even reached out to a lawyer friend for advice. His friend, an eccentric guy named Ted who specialized in tenant law, agreed to represent him pro bono after hearing about Karen's antics. "This is going to be fun," Ted said with a grin that made Jack slightly nervous. When the court date finally arrived, Jack walked into the courtroom flanked by Ted and two of his most loyal workshop attendees. An elderly woman named Martha who had been fined for planting tomatoes instead of flowers, and a retired Marine named Hank who had once been cited for having an unapproved flagpole. Karen was already there, sitting at the plaintiff's table with Dick the lawyer and two other HOA board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, called the court to order and asked Dick to present his case. Dick launched into a long-winded speech about how Jack's actions were undermining community standards and setting a dangerous precedent for other residents. Ted leaned over and whispered to Jack, "He talks like someone who gets excited about PowerPoint presentations." When it was Ted's turn to speak, he wasted no time poking holes in Dick's arguments. He pointed out that many of the HOA's rules were vague or unenforceable under state law. He also presented evidence that Karen had failed to follow proper procedures when issuing fines, something she clearly hadn't expected anyone to notice. But Ted saved his best move for last. He submitted into evidence a series of emails between Karen and other board members that Jack had obtained through a public records request. The emails revealed that Karen had specifically targeted Jack because she saw him as a threat to her authority. In one particularly damning email, Karen wrote, "If we let him get away with this off-grid nonsense, everyone will think they can do whatever they want." The courtroom erupted into murmurs as Ted read the email aloud. Karen looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. By the time closing arguments rolled around, it was clear which way things were leaning. The judge ruled in Jack's favor on most counts, dismissing several of the HOA's claims outright and ordering them to refund some of his fines. As for Karen, well, let's just say her reign as clipboard queen wasn't looking so secure anymore. Jack walked out of that courtroom feeling like he'd just won an Oscar for best performance in a revenge story. And honestly, he kind of had. Jack walked out of the courtroom like a man who had just conquered Mount Everest, except instead of snow-capped peaks. His victory was over HOA bylaws and Karen's iron grip on the neighborhood. He didn't just win. He obliterated their case, leaving Karen and her clipboard army scrambling to pick up the pieces of their shattered egos. The courtroom victory was sweet, but Jack wasn't done. No, this wasn't just about winning a lawsuit, it was about sending a message. The first thing Jack did after his legal triumph was throw a party. And not just any party, a full-blown Freedom from HOA Tyranny bash. Invitations were printed on paper shaped like chicken mailboxes and hand-delivered to every resident in the neighborhood. Jack even hired a local band called the HOA Rebels to perform songs about sticking it to the man. The guest list included everyone who had ever been fined for unauthorized landscaping or unapproved mailbox designs, along with a few curious onlookers who just wanted free barbecue. Karen, of course, wasn't invited, but that didn't stop her from showing up anyway, clipboard in hand and rage in her eyes. This gathering violates HOA rules about noise levels and unauthorized events, she shouted as soon as she stepped onto Jack's property. Jack smiled and handed her a plate of ribs. Relax, Karen. It's not unauthorized. It's celebratory. Karen sputtered incoherently before storming off, muttering something about filing another complaint. Jack didn't care. He was too busy enjoying the sight of Martha, the tomato-growing rebel, teaching Hank how to do the chicken dance next to Jack's neon green mailbox. The party was a hit, but Jack knew it wouldn't be enough to keep Karen at bay. She was like a mosquito, annoying, persistent, and impossible to ignore for long. So Jack decided to take things further. If Karen wanted to play dirty, he'd show her just how creative he could be. First, Jack launched what he called Operation Transparency. Using his newfound status as a local hero, he convinced several residents to demand access to HOA financial records, a right guaranteed under state law but rarely exercised. What they found was both hilarious and infuriating. Karen had been using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, including dry cleaning bills and subscriptions to obscure home decor magazines. Jack wasted no time spreading the word. He printed flyers detailing Karen's questionable spending habits and distributed them throughout the neighborhood. The flyers featured a cartoon drawing of Karen clutching dollar bills while sitting on a throne made of clipboards. Beneath it were the words, "Where are your dues really going?" Karen tried to deny everything, but the damage was done. Residents started showing up at HOA meetings demanding answers, and Karen's usual air of authority began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. But Jack wasn't satisfied with just exposing Karen's financial shenanigans. He wanted to dismantle her entire regime. His next move was pure genius. He ran for HOA president. At first, people thought he was joking. Jack, the guy with the chicken mailbox and spiteful rock garden, running for president? But as word spread about his plans to reform the HOA, eliminating unnecessary fines, reducing dues, and promoting sustainable living practices, support began pouring in from all corners of the neighborhood. Karen tried everything she could to sabotage his campaign. She sent out letters accusing Jack of being anti-community and disruptive. She even tried to bribe Hank with free flagpole approval if he'd endorse her instead. Hank responded by planting an enormous American flag in his yard, with a sign underneath that read, "Vote for Jack." On election day, Jack won by a landslide, the kind of victory that made Karen's clipboard tremble in fear. The first thing he did as president was hold an emergency meeting where he proposed sweeping changes to the HOA bylaws. Gone were the ridiculous rules about mailbox designs and approved greenery. In their place were new guidelines focused on fairness and common sense. Karen sat silently throughout the meeting, her face frozen in an expression somewhere between rage and defeat. "Any objections?" Jack asked cheerfully when he finished presenting his reforms. Karen opened her mouth as if to speak but quickly closed it again when she realized she had no allies left in the room. Jack grinned. Motion passed. With Karen effectively neutralized, Jack turned his attention to making real improvements in the neighborhood. He organized community cleanup days where residents worked together to beautify shared spaces without fear of being fined for stepping on unapproved grass. He set up workshops on solar panel installation and water conservation techniques, turning his homestead into a hub for sustainable living education. And perhaps most importantly, he established what he called the Anti-Karen Clause, a new bylaw that strictly limited the powers of future HOA presidents to prevent anyone from becoming another clipboard-wielding tyrant. Under Jack's leadership, the neighborhood transformed into something resembling an actual community rather than a dictatorship ruled by arbitrary fines and passive-aggressive letters. People started planting tomatoes without fear of retribution. Children played freely without worrying about noise complaints. Even Hank's flagpole became an unofficial landmark known as Freedom Tower. As for Karen, well, she eventually resigned from the HOA altogether. A move that surprised no one but delighted everyone. Rumor had it she moved to another neighborhood where she could start fresh with a new clipboard and unsuspecting residents who hadn't yet learned her ways. Jack didn't celebrate her departure, not openly anyway, but he did host one final workshop titled, How to Spot a Karen Before It's Too Late. By the end of it all, Jack had achieved something remarkable. He turned what could have been a miserable ordeal into an opportunity for growth. Not just for himself, but for everyone around him. And while he'd never admit it out loud, there was a part of him that almost wanted to thank Karen for giving him the chance to prove just how much one person could accomplish when pushed too far. Almost, but not quite. Jack's reign as HOA president was nothing short of legendary. He had taken a neighborhood riddled with petty fines and oppressive rules and turned it into a bastion of freedom, creativity, and slightly chaotic charm. People were happier, lawns were wilder, and mailboxes came in every shape imaginable. From flamingos to miniature rocket ships, Jack had done what no one thought possible. He had defeated the HOA system from within, dismantling its clipboard dictatorship one absurd rule at a time. But Jack wasn't content to simply bask in his victory. No, Jack had bigger plans. He wanted to share his story with the world, to inspire others to rise up against the tyranny of HOAs everywhere. And so, with the help of Martha, the tomato-growing rebel, and Hank, the flagpole enthusiast, Jack launched his next big project, a YouTube channel called Off-Grid Justice. The channel was a mix of tutorials, storytelling, and unapologetic satire aimed at exposing the ridiculousness of HOA culture. Jack's first video was titled, How to Survive Your HOA Without Losing Your Sanity, and it featured him standing in front of his infamous chicken mailbox while holding a clipboard he'd spray-painted with the words, Karen Repellent. Welcome to Off-Grid Justice, Jack began, grinning at the camera. If you're tired of being fined for having the wrong shade of beige on your house or planting tomatoes instead of tulips, you've come to the right place. Today, we're going to talk about how to fight back against HOA tyranny and win. The video was an instant hit. People from all over the country flooded the comments section with their own horror stories about HOAs. Everything from being fined for parking in their own driveway to being told their dog was too large for community standards. Jack responded to every comment with a mix of humor and practical advice, earning himself a loyal following almost overnight. As the channel grew, Jack started branching out into other topics. He posted videos like, Top 10 Most Ridiculous HOA Rules. Spoiler, they're all real. And DIY mailboxes that will make your HOA cry. One particularly popular video featured Hank demonstrating how to install a flagpole that complied with every known regulation while still being tall enough to annoy Karen-level enforcers. But it wasn't all jokes and tutorials. Jack also used the platform to advocate for real change. He encouraged viewers to educate themselves about their rights as homeowners and shared tips on how to challenge unfair fines or bylaws. He even started a petition calling for stricter oversight of HOAs at the state level, which quickly gained thousands of signatures. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Karen, who had been watching Jack's rise with increasing horror, sent him a cease and desist letter accusing him of defamation and damaging the reputation of HOAs everywhere. Jack framed the letter and hung it next to his collection of court documents from their lawsuit. Karen, he said in his next video, holding up the framed letter for his audience to see, if you're watching this, and I know you are, I just want you to know that your cease and desist letter is now part of my decor. Thanks for contributing to my aesthetic. The comments section exploded with laughter. But Jack's favorite moment came when he received an email from a viewer named Linda who lived in Florida. Linda had been battling her own HOA for years over her decision to paint her house bright pink, a color she loved but which her HOA deemed too flamboyant. Inspired by Jack's videos, Linda had fought back using some of his strategies and won her case in court. Thank you for giving me the courage to stand up for myself, Linda wrote. My house is pink again, and it's beautiful. Jack read the email aloud in one of his videos, wiping away a fake tear for comedic effect before saying, Linda, if you're watching this, you're my hero. And if your HOA tries anything else, let me know. I've got plenty more tricks up my sleeve. By now, Jack's channel had become so popular that he started getting requests from media outlets wanting to interview him about his story. He appeared on local news segments, podcasts, and even a daytime talk show where he brought along Martha and Hank as his unofficial entourage. During one interview, the host asked Jack if he ever regretted taking on the HOA. "Regret," Jack said with a laugh. "The only thing I regret is not painting my rain barrels sooner." But despite all the attention, Jack remained grounded, or as grounded as someone with a chicken-shaped mailbox could be. He continued hosting workshops on sustainable living practices and helping neighbors navigate their own HOA issues. He even started offering free consultations for anyone who needed advice on how to deal with Karen-level enforcement tactics. In one particularly memorable consultation, Jack helped a man named Steve design a mailbox shaped like a dragon that breathed smoke whenever someone tried to take photos of it. A direct response to Steve's HOA sending inspectors armed with cameras. "Steve," Jack said proudly after seeing the finished product, "you've officially outdone me. I'm retiring my chicken mailbox immediately." As Jack's influence grew, so did his impact. HOAs across the country began facing increased scrutiny as homeowners demanded more transparency and fairness in their policies. Some even started adopting reforms inspired by Jack's videos, a fact that made him both proud and slightly suspicious. "I'm not saying I trust them," Jack joked in one video after hearing about an HOA implementing new sustainability guidelines. "But if they start planting tomatoes instead of tulips, I'll consider it progress." By now, Jack's story had become more than just a tale of revenge. It was a movement. People everywhere were standing up against arbitrary fines and ridiculous rules, armed with nothing but determination and maybe a few chicken-shaped mailboxes. And through it all, Jack remained true to himself. Sarcastic, resourceful, and unapologetically off-grid. So if you've ever felt trapped by your HOA, or just want tips on how to make your rain barrels look fabulous, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, comment below with your own HOA horror stories. I read every single one. And hit that subscribe button for more off-grid justice. Because together, we can defeat Karen and every clipboard-wielding tyrant who dares stand in our way.